Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this very important webinar. I'm Christine Chen, Executive Director and co-founder of Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote. And with me today will be Karthik Ramakrishnan, Executive Director and founder of AAPI Data. I'm excited to welcome all of you as we dive into APIAVote and API Data's 2024 voter survey, which was conducted by NORC at the University of Chicago. This survey provides crucial insights into how Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders plan to vote this November, who they plan to vote for, their candidate favorability, level of voter engagement and contact that they received, and issues that matter most to this fastest growing electorate in the US. Earlier this summer, we released our 2024 Asian American Voter Survey, while President Biden was still in the race, and now with Vice President Harris as the Democratic nominee, this updated survey captures how AAPI voters are responding to that shift. Your participation in this webinar and coverage of our survey findings are critical as we review and discuss the broader implications for the API electorate in this election. So before we dive into the findings of this important survey, I also want to take a moment to highlight what APIAVote nationally is doing with our local partners to turn these insights into action. Beyond analyzing the data, we are working tirelessly to ensure that Asian American and Pacific Islanders are heard at the ballot box this November and continue to turn out in record numbers, as we've seen in past years. We are actively working to get out the vote. Our direct mail will actually be sent to 1.9 million API households in 23 key states in 18 different languages. We're also following up with these whole households through extensive phone calls and texts, and personally also engaging API voters across the country. We're also focused on serving in-language digital ads. All this messaging and engagement ties back to our multilingual voter hotline that we co-manage with Asian American Advancing Justice, AJC, to provide essential voter information and support in languages spoken by our diverse communities. And we're actively monitoring disinformation and misinformation that threatens to misinform and disenfranchise our community. These combined efforts are critical to making sure that API voters are informed and ready to make an impact this election season. So thank you for being here, and we look forward to sharing our findings with you. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Karthik to actually talk a little bit about the highlights and the methodology.
Great. Thank you, Christine, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're excited to strengthen this partnership between API Data and APIAVote through our regular surveys, as well as through our fact sheets, and in the work of informing and boosting civic engagement and civic empowerment of our communities. Karthik Ramakrishnan, I'm a researcher at the University of California, Berkeley, and the founder and executive director of API Data. We'll just quickly give a little bit of background and high-level findings, and then Christine will talk about some of the important civic engagement findings as it relates to voter interest and engagement by political parties with voters, and then I'll present opinion data related to the presidential race, as well as some key issues. Next slide, please. So some key findings. So this is a big one. What we saw between 2020 and 2024 was a significant drop in support for Biden, but it had not led to a corresponding increase in support for Trump. So essentially, Asian American voters were on the sidelines and seemingly dissatisfied with the choices before them. Now we see a big jump in support for Harris, whether measured by vote choice or by favorability, which will be in the next slide. We also had some important findings on Harris's identity. There's a lot of talk about race in this election. Gender has not been talked about as much, but as you'll see, gender plays a very significant role for the first time ever in the polling that we've done over the last decade and that I've done before that. Next slide, please. In terms of candidate favorability, we see a significant jump in Harris favorability from as little as 3 months ago And even compared to a year ago, using the Amplify panel on which this survey is based. And I'll say that in a bit on the methodology. So it's very different to have Harris in the presidential seat as opposed to the vice presidential seat. She's definitely shaken up the race, and her favorability has gone up significantly in a matter of months. Trump's favorability has not changed much, and it's net unfavorable. And we find much stronger favorability for Walz as opposed to Vance, although for both of them, a significant proportion don't know enough to have an opinion. Next slide. We also have data on certainty of voting, and Christine will talk about that, as well as voter contact and outreach. These data and these slide decks the slide deck will be available on our corresponding websites at the conclusion of this webinar. Next slide. And I'll just say finally on methodology, this is based on NORC's Amplify AAPI panel, which offers in-language support for Mandarin, Cantonese, Vietnamese, and Korean. And it is built, it is nationally representative and covers, I believe, about 85% of the Asian American electorate nationally. Survey respondents are Asian American voters as well as non-voters, so there are oversamples of registered voters and citizens, but you'll see on our website our findings both for all adults as well as for the registered voter population. So with that, I will turn it over to Christine to present the first set of results.
Great, thank you so much. So we're going to go ahead and for the next slide, we'll actually go ahead and show the details in terms of our community about how absolutely certain that they're willing to vote. So we've actually seen an increase since the nomination of Kamala Harris as a Democratic nominee. The shift from April and May, when we conducted the Asian American voter survey, was at 68%. Now is at a high of 77%. This is quite compatible to what we saw in the 2020 Asian American voter survey. As you can see by age, and this is quite indicative in terms of what we've seen of other communities as well as other election cycles, where the older generation is more certain in terms of them being able to cast their ballot, and then the younger generation lags a little bit behind. But hopefully the next 4 or 5 weeks, that will actually continue to change, and we will actually make headway in terms of that. In the next slide, we will also look at how that breaks down in terms of by ethnicity. As you can see here, Asian Indian, Filipino, Japanese Americans are absolutely certain at higher rates that they will be voting. One thing I'd like to point out is that these are communities that English is where they're quite proficient in English, versus the Chinese, Vietnamese populations are more limited English proficient. And so this is where we're also really conscious that we need to do a lot more work in limited English proficient communities and making sure that we provide translated assistance and materials for them to be able to feel confident that they're able to cast their ballot. In the next slide, we will also go ahead and talk a little bit about contacts by parties and other groups. A lot of the what we've seen is that the increase of people willing to vote is also correlates to the amount of contact that the party is actually increasing their work in. In comparison to April and May to September, we've seen a growth from the Democratic Party of contacts from 45% to now 62%. Republicans have also increased at 38% to 47%. So the Democratic Party is doing a lot better. And what we've also seen is, especially with the Kamala Harris campaign, where they recently have been releasing 3 different videos and in-language advertising. That is where we're seeing a lot of that contact. In addition, since the DNC convention, we've also seen the formations of different affinity groups like the South Asians for Harris, Korean Americans for Harris, Filipinos American for Harris, and other entities like that. So this is where we're also seeing a lot of work being done by volunteers who are self-organizing and working with the campaigns to go ahead and do outreach as well. In the next slide, we will also look at a little bit more in terms of by ethnicity, who is being contacted by the Democratic Party. And once again, I'd like to point out the Chinese and Filipino community and the Vietnamese community are not necessarily being contacted as much as you're seeing with the Indian community and the Japanese community as well. Let's go ahead and look at the Republican Party in terms of how they're doing. As we noted, they're doing a little bit better than earlier this year. But once again, it's quite interesting that also the Japanese communities and Indian community is also being reached out to a lot more, also with the Republican Party as well. In the next slide, we'll also talk a little bit about concerns about the November elections. When specifically asked, the top issue that our voters are concerned about is about fake or false information about the candidates. Right after that is really violence after the elections, legal challenges, and threats of violence at the polls. So I know with APIAVote and a lot of our local partners, we are actually tapping into our trusted messengers in our communities and utilizing a network of volunteers to really be able to push out and monitor fake and false information, especially since there's such a huge concern from voters about this particular issue. In the next slide, you'll also see at the lower level additional concerns about the November elections, including voter fraud at the polls and not having my vote counted. So I think then what I'll go ahead and do now is turn it over to Karthik to talk a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of presidential
choice. Yeah.
Choice. Sorry.
No worries. It's been late nights for all of us. Thank you, Christine, and look forward to sharing the rest of the findings that will go a bit more into campaigns, parties, and policies, and then we'll turn it back to Christine for Q&A. Let's go to the next slide, please. So, drum roll in terms of presidential vote choice. Has Harris's candidacy made a difference? It absolutely has. We see a huge jump in support for Harris among Asian American voters. By the way, in our detailed findings, we also have Pacific Islanders and for APIs put together. But because the survey that we conducted in late spring was only of Asian Americans, that we don't include PIs in this over time comparison. You see for particular groups like Indian Americans and Filipinos, you see huge jumps in support. Next slide. And by the way, if you go back to the prior slide, if you look at Asian Americans, not only is a fast-growing electorate, but in significant numbers, for example, like Filipinos in Nevada, Indian Americans in Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Chinese Americans in many other states in the country, this is an electorate that is likely going to make a difference. Next slide. We see some modest decline in support for Trump since the April-May survey. And it's within the survey margin of error, both looking at this margin of error as well as the April-May data collection that we did. Next slide. And then just quickly, looking at different across groups, I will say that some people may be surprised by that Vietnamese finding. I am also surprised by that Vietnamese finding. So I don't know. We've seen higher than expected levels of Vietnamese Democratic support in a few surveys now, but this is the highest I've ever seen it. And I'm not sure if this is an exception or part of a pattern that's happening. So we will be monitoring that. But across the board, Harris, a majority of Asian Americans support Harris. We do see among Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, a slim majority support Trump. And that's something where it's monitoring as well in moving forward. I should caution that the sample size for the NHPI population is significantly smaller. The margin of error is plus or minus 18%. But still, We've seen other surveys in the past, including the AmeriSpeak panel, findings from the 2020 election, which suggested significant support for Trump among Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. Next slide, please. Looking in terms of age, we see similar levels of support for Harris versus Trump across age groups. And then we see higher support for Trump among those with advanced degrees. Next slide. For the first time ever, so that I've been looking at the data, we see a significant gender gap that is emerging. And this gender gap is largely due to women shifting even more strongly towards Harris than they were for Biden. So this is something that's notable, and we'll see at the end in terms of Harris's identity and how female APIs in particular resonate with that. Next slide. Candidate favorability. Let's go to the next slide. So here we see Harris and Walz and Trump and Vance. Generally speaking, as you might expect, in terms it correlates with what vote choice looks like. You see the highest levels of favorability among Asian Indians for Harris, and potentially due to shared heritage and perhaps greater name recognition and feeling of affinity, but you also see that for Walz. So partly could be in terms of the strength of Democratic Party identification as well, or the halo effect of Harris on Walz. By contrast, we see very low favorable ratings for Trump and Vance, with the exception of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders and their favorability for Trump. Next slide. We repeated a question that we had asked in the AP NORC survey earlier this year. And this is a single issue voter question. Let's go to the next slide. So the question is worded like this: is it possible you could ever vote for a candidate who does not share your views on each of the following, or is this issue so important that you could not ever vote for a candidate who disagrees with you? What the findings we have mirror those that we found several months ago. And this, again, it's not surprising to me anymore. The first time I saw it, it was surprising to me that racism and discrimination is at the top of the heap. And so what that tells me is that even if voters are dissatisfied with the economic performance or say on crime issues with the Democratic Party, the racial dog whistles and racial bullhorns coming out of the Republican side, especially on presidential candidate Trump and vice presidential candidate Vance, is going to hurt the Republican Party in terms of being unable to attract Asian American and Pacific Islander votes. Abortion policy is number two, and we're seeing that. It echoes what we saw earlier. And we also have detailed findings from our AP NORC survey collaboration earlier in the year, detailed findings on abortion and reproductive rights that I would encourage you all to see. But crime and violence is also there, right? And so, and that's something more among Republicans as an issue. Gun policy rounds out the top four. Next slide. Looking at differences by age, we see that crime and violence is more resonant among older API voters. So to the extent that the parties can try to gain advantage, that is an issue that they might want to pay attention to with that particular constituency. Next slide. And then when it comes to abortion policy, I just want to flag, not surprisingly perhaps, that this is stronger among women than men, but 52% of men say that this is an issue that it's so important to them that they would not vote for someone who they disagree with on the issue. We also see a stronger relationship on gun policy for women than men, but it's a majority for men as well. Next slide. Next set of issues, this rounds out the 8 issues that we asked about: immigration and the economy, climate change, and the Israel-Palestinian conflict. So this is notable that the Israel-Palestinian conflict, as we found several months ago, while there may be a lot of disagreement within both parties, but mostly within the Democratic Party on what needs to be done, it does not seem to be a litmus test or a single voter issue. Next slide. And we have further findings on how those single voter issues matter. when it comes to particular demographics. And as I said, that detailed slide deck will be on our websites. You can also dig through 200 plus pages of data tables if you would like. With the UN meeting this week, as well as the Quad summit that President Biden hosted with the leaders of India, Australia, and Japan, we also have candidate evaluation on foreign policy. You'll find that in the slide deck that'll be posted online. But the bottom line is that Asian American voters and API voters more generally think that Harris would do a better job when it comes to US foreign policy towards India, when it comes to US foreign policy towards China, and when it comes to US foreign policy towards Taiwan. So regardless of what might be going on in terms of domestic politics, this largely reflects the partisan lean of the electorate. Next slide. Finally, there are a lot of questions about candidate identity. And we have a lot of rich findings about how people think about the importance of different identities for themselves. But what we're going to focus on now is the kinds of identities that matter for representation. Next slide. So first, we had a set of questions asking about the importance of electing candidates who are women, younger adults, Asian Americans or Pacific Islanders, and people of color. And we find that this is, generally speaking, an important issue, either extremely important or very important in voters' minds. Stronger for having more women, but generally speaking, it's within the margin of error for most of these cases. There are some interesting differences when it comes to Asian American and Pacific Islander representation, and I should note, especially for Filipinos, that might reflect an underrepresentation of Filipinos in Congress and other major offices given the size of their population. By contrast, Indian Americans are fairly well represented given their size of the population. Next slide. We see some differences that are notable by age. So younger API voters are more likely to say that it's important to elect more women, more younger adults, more Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and more people of color. Next slide. In terms of gender differences, we see that women put a greater priority in having more women elected to office. Next slide. And also more people of color elected to office. And then finally, when it comes to Harris's identity, actually, let's go to the prior slide because I want to create a little bit of mystery. So finally, when it comes to Harris's identity, one of the big questions was how much is her racial identity, either as an African-American or Black woman or Black person, or her Indian or Asian identity salient to voters. So let's go to the next slide. So I would have expected that her identity as an Asian Indian or South Asian would be the most important among Asian American groups, and certainly among Asian Indians. What is shocking and surprising to me is her identity as a woman. Well, it's not shocking. It makes sense, but it's not the first thing you would expect. So much of the campaign rhetoric about Harris herself, mostly by others, has been focused on her race, and her identity as a woman has not been explicitly mentioned by others. In addition, the candidate herself in the campaign has not centered gender and the historic nature of that for her presidential candidacy the way that Hillary Clinton did in 2016. And yet we see that her identity as a woman is the most important in terms of what Asian American voters perceive in terms of her candidacy. Next slide. And as before, we see that this is, it's more salient in terms of her gender identity and her racial identity among younger voters than among older voters. Next slide. And then finally, and importantly, her identity as a woman is inspiring, it seems, a lot of API women. There are 25% of men who say that's an important aspect of her identity, but a majority, close to a majority of API women say that her identity as a woman is an important aspect of her identity, And so that is politically consequential, as Christine and I have had different media interviews and to observe what we are seeing in the field. It's been true for many years now, but there's a special kind of grassroots mobilization among API women, and these data can help shed light on some of those dynamics. So with that, I'll turn it back to Christine, and we will move to Q&A.
Great. We are asking everyone to go ahead and put any of your questions in the Q&A box, and we will attempt to answer any questions that you may have.
So I see a question in the chat, and I can answer that. So the question is, what do you think is the biggest factor for Asian Americans choosing Harris as their president? Her personality, her policies, her joyful, positive campaign. We do have some questions in there about sharing one's background and culture, sharing one's policy views, and a couple of other factors. And it turns out that policy views is dominant, followed by background and culture. We didn't specifically ask about the vibe, but you will find that in our results. And actually, let's see. Yeah. So in terms of someone who represents our background and culture, actually, this is a way between Harris and Trump. We found that a majority of Asian Americans said that Harris more closely, 57% say background and culture. For Trump, it's only 13%, and 22% say neither, and 7% say both equally. When it comes to views on important policies, 54% side with Harris on that, 26% with Trump, 6% say both equally, 14% say neither. And then there are a couple of other questions we don't have graphics for, but you'll find it in our detailed PDF.
So Karthik, there is also a question like, are you able to disaggregate by religious preference?
Yeah, so this is something that we got the data just a few days ago. So we've been working at breakneck speed, but that is a good question, and that's something we'll do some subsequent analysis. And we did have a question, by the way, that's in the survey in terms of which candidate shares your religious beliefs. So that would be one in which we would expect to see a pretty significant difference. But good call on that. I would also expect some of the other policy priorities might vary by religion.
There are also a question in regards to, let's see. Can you speak more to how API voters feel about foreign policy? Is that something this electorate finds important when voting?
Thanks, Christine. Also in the Q&A, I see some questions that would be appropriate for you to answer. So people are using chat as well as Q&A. I would say if you can please type it in Q&A, that'll make it easier for us to track what's going on. Foreign policy traditionally has not been high in terms of salience among API voters. So that is important context. Certainly it matters among a certain subset of donors and issue activists, maybe people with business interests in countries of origin. But consistently, we've not seen that it moves the needle much. Most of the issues that matter to API voters are domestic issues. Foreign policy issues don't even break the top 5. Typically, they haven't this year in the different types of surveys that we've been looking at. That said, there's a lot of speculation and commentary about, I'll just say, for example, Indian Americans. I hear this all the time. People are like, oh, Indian Americans think Harris is terrible on US foreign policy towards India. Well, this is a representative national survey which indicates otherwise. So this is where data is important to correct some of the misperceptions about our communities, including within our own communities. We all have those loud uncles and aunties that might take up a lot of space, that portray a certain view, which is an important and valid one, but it might not be representative of the more general population.
Let's see. Okay, one question was like, I was curious about the data looks like in the swing states. Are there any interesting findings there? I will go ahead and try to address some of that in terms of the growth of the population. For instance, in Georgia, back in 2020, we know that Biden only won his election by less than 12,000 votes, and 26% of Asian Americans who voted in 2020 were first-time voters. So when you do the math, that equates to about 39,000 voters, which is 3 times the margin of victory, right? And so we know that even back in 2020, we made a difference in a number of these elections because of the slim margins. And then looking forward this year, just even looking at Georgia, you have over 272,000 AAPIs who are eligible to be registered and to actually cast their ballot. So that's why right now, as we just celebrate National Voter Registration Day, it is also about an important aspect that we go ahead and do our outreach to making sure that everyone who is eligible is also registered to actually go out and vote.
Yeah, the quick thing I'll say, Christine, part of the way I interpret that question is that we don't have enough sample size to break out swing states in this analysis. That said, from prior surveys, what we have seen is that if you take swing states as a whole and red states as a whole and blue states as a whole, there are basically, you see more of a split in red states where APIs live, but still the Democratic Party has an upper hand. But in swing states and blue states, it's very clearly more on the blue side than on the red side. So hopefully that's helpful. There are others who do surveys, but in swing states, I should note that many of them, if not most of them, they do not do it within language support. So treat that with a dose of caution, because in the past we've seen some pretty significant differences between English language respondents and Asian language respondents in surveys.
There's this question about what theories or thoughts do we have with the democratic shift among Vietnamese voters? I'll also weigh in a little bit here. We've actually been seeing the shift since 2020 and more pronounced even in 2022. Part of that is also you're seeing a second generation and also younger generation is coming of age that is also able to vote. And so that's also changing how they're shifting, especially in areas like Orange County and also in Houston and Texas, where you're seeing a large growth of the Vietnamese population.
Yeah.
Karthik, do you have other ideas?
Yeah, no, and I'll say it's important, and this is where various partners that APIAVote and others have on the ground, I think, are important to reach out to and talk to. Absolutely, Christine, I'm saying similar thing in terms of, we're starting to, maybe not third generation voters, but third generation folks that are starting to get politically conscious too, right, in the Vietnamese American community. So that generational shift is a dynamic. There's also, I think it's important to see what's happening on the ground. Part of the way I think could be a factor. Well, one of the things we should remember, the Vietnamese American community has not been steady, so in the sense that traditionally they've been a Republican constituency. Obama won the Vietnamese American vote in 2008 and 2012. And then Trump won the Vietnamese American vote in 2016 and 2020. Now, are they souring on Trump? Or maybe the fears of Biden and the Democrats were overblown and there's an updating of information? Or is it these new voters coming in, people who are newly eligible to vote, or maybe higher turnout among younger Vietnamese American voters who were eligible to vote in 2020, but did not turn out to vote? So all of these are potentially at play. I think it's important to listen to folks on the ground and to APIAVote's partners to understand what's going on.
Here's the question about, based on this, I feel Florida can be in play. What is your assessment?
I'll just get a little personal here. I now see Florida kind of like Texas, and apologies to all the people in Texas. I've been doing, I was doing dissertation work in Texas in 2020 and 2000. and people swore that Texas turning blue was just around the corner. But it feels what we've seen in presidential elections is that, you know, that whatever, even if it looks close, that closeness disappears. But that's the thing, you know, there's a high level of uncertainty in some of these states, like North Carolina, like Florida. I haven't seen much in the way of Texas, except maybe for the Senate race, you know, where it's competitive enough where the Asian American vote could make a difference. That said, there are surprises all the time, right? Some people might have predicted that Georgia would be, you know, ground central in terms of where the Senate control would hinge, and that API voters would make a critical difference there. But most would not have. I would not have predicted that, right? And I do this this kind of work for a living. So I think we should be ready for API voters being influential in a whole bunch of places. And if not in the presidential, then certainly in Senate races, as well as congressional and state races.
Let's see. How many?
And then, by the way, just quickly, I'll say we do API Data. If you go to our website, we have these resource guides where you can look at the API share of the electorate vis-a-vis, you know, these swing states as well as swing congressional districts.
Here's a question about the methodology and what this is covered. How many states are the participants of the survey from, and how many participants are surveyed? What do you think are the main reasons that Harris gains much higher support among API's voters than Biden?
Great. So in terms of the number of respondents, you'll see this, and you already see this in the PDFs. So it's 1,166 respondents when it comes to registered voters. It's a slightly lower number when it comes to all adults. And you might wonder, how is that possible? Well, the way the sample is constructed is that first there's a survey of adults and the weighting scheme in which it's pulling in data from different survey questions that are asked from all adults as opposed to registered voters. But a little over 1,000 respondents. Margin of error is plus or minus 4.7%. In the sampling frame, all 50 states are included in the panel. I have not looked to see how many actually participated in this survey, but this is designed to be nationally representative. Then finally, why is Harris doing so much better than Biden? Our survey data indicate, part of it is her gender as an asset, clearly, right, in terms of, especially among API women, but also among a significant proportion of API men. So that's making a difference. Other things are not part of this survey, but we have it in a survey that'll be coming out with AAPI NORC in mid-October, where we have questions about things like competence, and I don't think we asked about energy per se, but essentially, the ability to carry out the job of president. So Harris is inspiring a fair amount of confidence among API voters on that score.
So, Karthik, once again, a little bit about methodology. Where are the Southeast Asians vote in terms of in the data?
So we have, so this is built on the Amplify API panel. So this panel continues to get built out. I'll say that this is a panel that's created by NORC and AARP with investments by a whole bunch of different partners, including API Data, but a variety of foundations. So the goal is to continue to expand the panel to include additional Southeast Asian groups beyond Vietnamese. Even on the Vietnamese, and I'll say I'm on the Amplify API panel board, and I and others have been pushing to increase the sample size of Vietnamese so that the margins of error go down. But it's not just for Vietnamese. For many of the communities, the sample sizes are good enough for API Data and APIAVote to report out, but others may want 150 or 200 respondents for the group rather than 100 respondents to be able to report out on the data. But the commitment is there, and I would ask you to take it up with the Amplify team. They do have some investments specifically to increase sample sizes for different communities. The one thing I'll say about Southeast Asian as a category, and even South Asian, Right now, it's possible to actually generate those estimates, but especially for the South Asian population, it's the large Indian population kind of will have the strongest effect on what it means to be South Asian from that finding, as opposed to Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, for example. So we're still, I would say, at least a few years away from being able to disaggregate the Southeast Asian and South Asian populations.
So we have a number of questions about like, what does the data show about API voter trends during this election season? Are there any explanations behind the trends? How can we use the data gathered from the survey for the future, specifically for predicting and during future elections? So I do want to go ahead and point out that both on APIAVote as well as API Data, we do have our crosstabs and findings, including other AP NORC surveys, as well as the Asian American Voter Survey that goes all the way back from to 2012. And from that, you can also look at the different trends throughout the different, for every 2 years, and realize that, you know, for instance, when it came to voter contact from the Democrat and Republican Party, before this cycle, I would say it was pretty much always lingered around the 50%. And even though our community was growing in size, that they were not necessarily keeping up in terms of their investments and activations to actually reach more of our community. So I'm really excited to actually see that there is more investments and activations being done this cycle to be able to reach our growing electorate.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. I see one question that came in the chat, asked about margin of error for Asian Indians. So that margin of error is 13.6%. What I'll say is that, these are all population weighted. So the point estimate takes into account the relative sizes of different groups in terms of their share of the adult citizen population. It's also judgment calls, right? So when I look at the data here, they're in line with other surveys that we've done as well as what others have done. So that increases confidence in the accuracy, if you will, of the estimate. So we're not at a point yet where we can aggregate surveys the way that New York Times and Nate Silver and Washington Post do. Hopefully someday we will get there. I'm just happy that we're able to produce more than one survey in a year. And through Amplify and through the AP NORC partnership, being able to produce several surveys in a given year.
There's a question about how ANHPIs can be a margin of victory for the Harris-Walz this election cycle based on the results of the survey. And overall, I will also just address this in terms of how API voters can be a margin of victory for also down ballot races, which is equally just as important for both Democrats and Republicans in all these different battleground states. So we know that in 2020, that 21% of our voters were first-time voters, and that was as high as 26% in Georgia and 25% in Nevada. And we see that across a lot of these battleground states, as well as non-battleground states. So we know not only is our community growing in size, as we saw in the 2020 census, but they are becoming citizens and also registering and turning out to vote. So when these margin of victories are so slim, and these campaigns are looking for additional votes to add to their win number, they have to engage the API electorate, because we are bringing in new voters, and it's quite sizable because we are one of the fastest growing electorates. It's only advantageous that they actually include us in all the investments as well as their strategies. So Karthik,
there's a question about kind of referendum on Trump. By the way, I should say this is a C3 conversation, so you'll notice some of the steers that we can't give advice to any particular campaign on what they should be doing, other than go invest in outreach in voters, because that matters. In terms of, is this a referendum on Trump? I think this is kind of, and I'll say this as a political scientist by training. What's interesting is typically, right, if Biden were running, if an incumbent is running, it's seen as a referendum election on the incumbent. And the challenger is usually someone who's not served as president before. So even prior to that, it was a very unusual case to have a former president running against a current president. Another typical thing you see is the vice president usually is seen as part of that administration. And then we saw this with Al Gore, for example, right? Where the vice president is seen as carrying the legacy or the burden of the prior administration. What's interesting about this election is that Harris seems to represent a change candidate with someone who is a former president challenging the incumbent party. So it's really fascinating. And then, of course, people's identities, how they show up, and also their rhetoric and what they are doing, right? Is it a base mobilization strategy or a bridge building strategy? Harris is going for a bridge building strategy, but there is base mobilization, as you can tell, especially among female API voters, as well as other key constituency groups. Trump, on the other hand, seems to be primarily focused on a base mobilization strategy rather than a bridge strategy. So we will see what happens, which strategy ultimately will succeed come November.
There's a question about what theories or thoughts do we have with the conservative shift and support among NHPI voters. I will say, at least based from our partners, it has been flagged that a number of the Pacific Islander communities are organized socially around the churches. So that could also play a factor. And then also a number of the Pacific Islanders, because where the Pacific Islands are situated, there's a huge military presence. And so influence of them being involved with the military is also another factor. But that's all anecdotal, and we actually do really need to do a lot more research and engagement with the NHPI communities.
Well, what I would say though, but Christine, that to me, based on prior data that I've seen, makes sense on the religiosity side. It's possible also incumbents throughout the world are not popular right now. So I don't know, for example, in Hawaii, what the sentiment is about the Maui fires and the administration's kind of responsiveness to that. So some of these things also transcend party in terms of incumbent party performance.
Let's see, do we have anything more to say about Harris genders more salient to API women voters versus her racial identity?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll say something, but Christine, I think, I've heard you talk about at least what you've observed, right, out in the field, both virtually and in person, kind of grassroots energy and mobilization. What I see is, I mean, from the data and from observation, that it's not to say that her Asian American identity doesn't matter, but maybe because it's talked about so much, it's kind of just baked in and taken as a given. What's not talked about is the historic nature of her candidacy as a woman and potentially the first female president. So, but Christine, I'll leave it to you to answer more on that.
Yeah, and so what we've also seen on the ground is that a lot of the mobilization is also being organized by API women as well. And so that could also play a factor. We also know that a number of different organizations are also led by API women. And so, what we're seeing is that a lot of the organizing being done for the Harris campaign is really being led by the API women across the country and at the local level. Another question is around, is a 1,000 sample size enough to make this survey fully representative of the AANHPI population?
So the answer is yes. So usually, you see national surveys of the American population with 1,000 sample size. So it's fundamental nature of how probability-based sampling works. One way I explain it is, imagine that you have a big pot of sangria or stew. If you're just taking a ladle and taking it from the top, that would not be representative. But if you stir it and then you dip it in and take it out, there's a good chance that you will have all of the different chunks in that ladle that you take up. So that's how That's the fundamental basis of probability-based sampling as a way to be able to speak to the large community. Now, if we want to be able to say something with small margins of error for any particular community, then you need much larger sample sizes, right? In my ideal world, I would have 300 to 400 per group, but it's just not feasible right now, given the cost of reaching out to these communities and to do it in a timely manner. So folks, like, this survey was drafted in August and it was put into the field and all the data was collected in a little over a week. This is a fundamental difference between mainstream polling and polling in our communities. It usually takes a lot longer, it's a lot more expensive, and therefore it's far less frequent, even if people want to prioritize this. So, but let's keep plugging away at it. I love the fact that the Associated Press has this partnership to do this. Let's get the New York Times to do it. Let's have the Washington Post. They have very large budgets, and they should also be asked to make sure that we have more data on our communities so that we can compare across to see if maybe a survey is off compared to others. This is what happens for other communities. Why not for ours?
And I will also say, as we conduct exit polls on election day, that we really need to focus on making sure that APIs are also included in that sample size. So many times when I look at, they may have some data now at the national level, but then when I look at data for specific states where we know we have sizable populations, that data is missing. And so for all of you here, we're encouraging you, especially if you have access to the different media outlets, for you to weigh in to ensure that we are also included in those exit polls. So I think with that, we are near the end. So we just want to go ahead and maybe close out as a reminder that all of the crosstabs and information is on both of our websites at API Data as well as APIAVote. We will continue to provide more insights as we continue to dig a little bit deeper, but we want to at least provide with you this most recent information. But as we said, that there are a lot more insights that you could dig in a little bit deeper through the crosstabs. Karthik?
Yeah, and I'll add that I'm in the process, at least on our website, to upload the PDF of the presentation. You already have the crosstabs. And I believe the APIAVote team will be uploading the video of this briefing for folks who want to refer to it later. But thank you, Christine, APIAVote. I'll also give a huge shout out to people on our team, including Lisa, Patricia, Fontaine, Connie, and so many others who have helped. We sprinted for 5 days to be able to produce all of this. So hopefully we'll get a little bit of rest. But thank you, everyone from our team and the APIAVote team for putting this together.
Special thanks to Rob Ping Chen and Kate Wieland from the APIAVote team for pulling this all together. So thank you, everyone. We'll be in contact with all of you after this this webinar is done, and we'll be sure to send you all the links to all this information. Thank you. Have a good day.